Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of the Aftermath series. Let us waste no time at all and dive right into this week's episode of Critical Role. So at the beginning of this episode, the party has a fair bit of downtime on their hands, a few days to be exact. So we'll just briefly go over what each of the party members decided to do with their time. Yasha decided to spend her time reading the book that Ford gave her. Now apparently, upon completing this book, Yasha's strength stat should get a nice little boost, so that'll be a nice increase in her damage and overall effectiveness as a barbarian. She also, along with Ford and Beau, decided to do a little bit of investigating into a potential fighting pit, but more on that later. But specifically for Yasha, she was seeking this fighting pit as a sort of therapy. Also, more on that later. But that's essentially what Yasha decided to do with her time, just spending her time in the gardens, reading her muscle book. Caduceus Clay spent his time rather leisurely, simply practicing this new bone flute that he picked up from Kiona, the interesting shopkeeper of the cryptic collection. Jester did a little bit of scrying on Kiri, simply just to check up on her and make sure that she's fine, and through her scrying, it seems that Kiri is doing a-okay. She also took the time to message 3 different individuals: the Plank King, Beauregard's dad, and the Inevitable End. Now ultimately, we didn't get any new information from these messages, other than the fact that Beau's dad believes that Jester, this ominous voice inside his head, is perhaps responsible for the deaths of the rival wine company in Comorta. But we do know that Oban is actually responsible for that family's downfall. But Beau's dad, being the superstitious man that he is, believes that Jester might be responsible. The Plank King had no idea who Jester was or who this voice was, so we didn't really get anything from that exchange. And with the Inevitable End made it clear that they do not wish to see the party ever again. So unfortunately, the Inevitable End will not be the inevitable friend. Caleb spent some of his time visiting the Soltris Academy with Knott and Ford, and he took a small trip down memory lane as he looked back to the times when he was an ambitious young student, hoping to one day become a professor of this very academy. But, as we know, things did not go as planned, and Trent set him on a very different path, a path that led to the death of his family members at Caleb's own hand, and then Caleb ended up going crazy, sent to an asylum, and a whole bunch of awful stuff transpired. Nothing that Caleb was expecting. But now Caleb has a new goal, and with this new goal in mind, he sets out on finishing the spells that Halas had began to create. The spells that will hopefully revert Knott to her true form. But as Matt described, this process is going to take a lot of time, but Caleb definitely seems focused and proud to be on such an important task for a dear friend of his. Ford spent his time meditating on the Wild Mother and trying to become more in tune with her desires of not only himself, but of the world around him. Knott didn't have anything particular she wanted to do. She sort of just popped up here and there on everyone else's downtime. So nothing too important happened with Knott. But with Beauregard, she spent a lot of her time working out with Ford and also doing a lot of heavy research of her own in the libraries of Rexingtrum. She did a little bit of research into the archaeological digs in Pride's Call, where she did verify the story of Trent Ickathon, where they did uncover one of these beacons. So Trent was not completely lying. There was some truth to what he was saying. However, there is still the fact of the 3rd beacon still somewhere in the Empire that the Assembly is very well aware of. We just don't know where this 3rd beacon is. Beau also did a little bit of research into the earlier days of the Empire and who was responsible for the gods that are being worshipped within the empire. It was discovered that these select gods were chosen because they align closely to the empire's philosophy as a whole. And the only real reason they have gods of worship to begin with is because it made the joining of the Julius Dominion and the empire a lot easier, since the Julius Dominion had some gods of worship and they weren't too keen on the abolishment of religion as a whole. So the empire compromised, allowed these select gods to be worshipped, and there's been peace, more or less. During Beau's downtime, there was also a small side conversation with Jester, where Jester was worried that Beau was upset with her for not rescuing her in the Battle of the Cathedral. As we do know, Beau did go unconscious and came close to death, so Jester just felt guilty that she wasn't there to rescue Beau. But Beau obviously forgave Jester and doesn't blame her at all for what happened. As the conversation progressed, Molly was brought up and his tarot cards, and Beau's dad was brought up about his superstitions, and ultimately, it would appear that Jester is now interested in becoming a tarot card reader. So perhaps in the future, maybe we'll see her give some readings for the other members of the party. But with all that being said, that about does it for the period of downtime that the party had at their disposal. Now we'll go into some of the more interesting aspects of this episode, starting with one of the more important parts, and that is Caleb deciding to visit Astrid. Now, this is a moment we have been waiting for since we even heard of Astrid, since we even heard of Caleb's backstory. This is a moment that Caleb himself has been dreading for a very long time. Ever since he went crazy and left the academy, went on his journey, he is finally ready to meet his past. And so as he makes his way to Astrid's house, anxiety levels are just so high. We really feel for Caleb in this moment. We know what he's going through. And so we're right there with him, holding his hand as he enters Astrid's estate. And ultimately, we don't know how Astrid is going to react to Caleb. In Caleb's mind, he might think that Astrid absolutely hates Caleb for seemingly abandoning her. He might fear that she is completely brainwashed by Trent, and she may lash out at him as soon as she sees him. We don't know who Astrid is. We only know who she was. But Caleb sits down in her study, and a few moments later, Astrid enters. And in Caleb's eyes, she looks pretty much as he remembers her. She does have a new scar along the side of her face, but she still looks the same. The conversation began with Caleb inquiring about his past and what happened prior to him going insane. And Astrid showed genuine concern and love for Caleb in this moment. She explained how Caleb had a breaking point, and the death of his family sort of sent him spiraling out of control. And in the process, Caleb did burn Astrid, leaving a burn scar along her neck, which definitely doesn't help the guilt that weighs heavily on Caleb's shoulders. But she goes on to explain that Astrid and Eodwulf brought him to the sanatorium in hopes that he would recover and return to his normal self. And she goes on to explain that when Astrid and Eodwulf would visit him, he would have recovered somewhat, but then would revert back to his crazy self. But as we know, Caleb eventually had his mind restored by a woman within this sanitarium, and Caleb eventually escaped, never seeing Astrid again until now. But Caleb goes into explaining Trent is an evil man, and he hopes that Astrid isn't too far gone. And then Astrid explains how she's aware that Trent is an unsavory fellow and that she has done things that she's not proud of, but she does them for the good of the Empire. She's stopped terrible things from happening to protect the people of the Empire. She explains how she doesn't regret the things she's done, but she does think and dwell on all of the families she's destroyed, all of the people she's killed, but she does it knowing that she's protecting what she believes in. Which, for Caleb, that might be worse than what he's expecting. He might have been more comfortable with her being completely brainwashed and completely devoted, but now he sees that she's fully aware of the things that are going on. She knows what she's doing could be seen as wrong and evil, but she's doing it because she thinks it's right, which might be worse than brainwashing. But again, throughout this conversation, it's very clear that Astrid genuinely cares for Caleb's well-being, or at least that seems to be the sentiment she's giving off. As we do know, she is an extremely highly trained assassin. This whole thing could very well be a setup, and Trent instructed her to get close with Caleb so that she may take him out when the time is right. Now, obviously, that is a very dark theory, and hopefully that's not the case, but we can't completely count it out because we know how sinister Trent can be. But for the time being, it seems that a relationship is still salvageable between Caleb and Astrid, but the conversation does ultimately come to an end with both Astrid and Caleb wanting to see each other again. And overall, I think that conversation went a lot better than most of us hoped. I think a lot of us were on board with Caleb in his thought process of Astrid being totally brainwashed, totally evil, and him just coming to terms with what he might face. But the conversation went far better than most of us probably hoped. And after that heavy, emotional conversation, we get to move on to a more lighthearted part of this episode. The party asked around town looking for a fighting pit, which they ultimately did find. There's a fighting pit called the Stone Coffin, where the party arranged 3 fights to take place. Yasha decided to fight the champion of fisticuffs. Beau also decided to take part in a fight of fists, and then Ford was the last one who decided to have a fight with steel. Fast forwarding to the night of the fight, Beauregard kicks off the evening's entertainment with her fight with a older gentleman. And Beauregard hilariously beats the crap out of this old man and finishes the fight within a few rounds. Ford's fight is the next one up for the evening, where he fights a familiar opponent, Darrow of the Stubborn Stock. We met this lad way back in around episode 18, 17, one of those episodes around that time period, during the Harvest Clothes Festival, where the party partook in the arena of Zadash. So it's definitely been some time since we've seen Darrow, but he is still his jovial, friendly self. This fight also lasted only a few rounds, where Ford unfortunately fell because he took a whopping 92 damage in a single critical strike by Darrow, who just happens to be a paladin to Pellar. So as we know with paladins, when they land a critical hit, they just unleash all of their divine smites to unleash a devastating attack. And so Ford's fight with Darrow really only lasted like 3 or 4 rounds. A whopping 92 damage is definitely enough to annihilate anyone at this level. But Darrow, being his friendly self, graciously accepted his victory and assisted Ford in recovering from his injuries. 2 very hilarious back-to-back fights that ended within just a few rounds, but that doesn't set the tone for the final fight with Yasha versus the champion of this arena. The episode took a darker, heavier, emotional turn, similar to the tone that was felt with the conversation between Astrid and Caleb. However, with this battle, it would appear that Yasha wasn't even trying to win. During her battle with the champion, who was a barbarian herself, a frenzied barbarian who taps into her primal rage, Yasha was just taunting this champion over and over again and just giving her simple backhands. And when she would go for punches, she would pull them, trying not to do any damage at all. She was just throwing her around, knocking her to the ground, shoving her up against the wall, just repeatedly taunting this champion, telling the champion to give it her all, telling her that the champion is weak, asking her to prove that she's the champion, which just made this frenzied barbarian go even crazier. But as the fight went on, she was sort of thrown off. This champion didn't know how to deal with Yasha not really fighting back. So it was just over and over again what felt like minutes going by of this champion just laying into Yasha and Yasha just taking it and taunting her over and over again. It felt strange. We didn't know what was going to happen. Yasha seemed to be punishing herself for everything she's done to the party, everything she did with Oban, what she did at the Cobalt Soul and Zadash. And finally, after several rounds going by, Yasha finally falls unconscious. But as she fell, a smile and a sense of relief washed over her as darkness took hold of her. The champion stood victorious over Yasha, but a celebration was not had, as the barbarian didn't know what to make of this situation and quickly left the arena, not even taking her earnings for the fight. Yasha was brought back to consciousness and met up with the group, who were concerned of her emotional state after this fight. They asked her if she was all right and if she feels that she's made amends with her past, which Yasha said that she doesn't think so. She thinks that there's going to be more that she has to deal with. And, well, I don't think that letting herself get beat up in a fight is a healthy coping mechanism, which will likely be unpacked later by Jester and Caduceus, but for the time being, the party is letting it sit, and they're going to bring it up later. But for now, Yasha seems to be content with the outcome of that battle. Definitely a heavier, darker tone than the first two fights that we had, but it's interesting to see how Yasha deals with the emotional stress that she's had to go through, given the recent events that happened. But then we end the episode with another lighthearted moment, as Nat was not there for the fights. She sort of snuck off before the evening events transpired, and she broke into a neighboring hat store to steal hats for each member of the party. And so after the fighting pit concluded, the party left and met up with Nat, where she distributed all of the hats for each of the members of the party. And that is where the episode concluded. Now the party once again has several paths they can likely take, but some questions to be asked are, what's going to happen with Yasha in her emotional state? Will the events that happened this night be brought up again with Caduceus and Jester? Will she finally be able to accept that the party is forgiving her, and will she be able to move on? This whole idea and path that she is taking resonates very much with Caleb, who, after the battle that Yasha had, Caleb brought 2 drinks to Yasha and let her know that Caleb himself understands what she's going through. He understands why she did what she did in that fight. So perhaps we'll see a conversation between Yasha and Caleb going over how to deal with what they've gone through. They also have to begin planning how they're going to bring up this peace talks with the Bright Queen, and ultimately where these peace talks will take place. But we're just going to have to wait for more answers, as Critical Role is now taking a 2-week winter break for the holidays. They have definitely earned a much-needed resting period before resuming their regular schedule. And so, with all of that being said, we are going to wrap up. Let me know all of your thoughts, feelings, and emotions during that episode. I hope you all have a fantastic holiday season, and I will see you all next year.